Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Inside Man, starring Denzel Washington, Clive Owen, Jodie Foster, Christopher Plummer, Willem Dafoe, and Chiwetel Ejiofor, directed by Spike Lee. Now, before I get into Inside Man, I did watch a Spike Lee movie before I think this was ever made called 25th Hour. I always wanted to see this one because I'm always a fan of Edward Norton, and I didn't know it was a Spike Lee film until I think when it came out on DVD or something back in the day. But I didn't know anything about Spike Lee back then. So let's see how. But as for this movie, I remember this is the first Spike Lee movie I ever went to go see in theaters. And what do I think of it? Well, we'll see how this goes. Let's get into it. We get introduced to Dalton Russell, played by Clive Owen, as he makes the audience understand why he robbed the biggest bank in New York City. In this movie's point of view, as he says that he can, and the audience is shown New York City, as I've been there a couple of times a long time ago, like a little over 20 years ago after the 9/11 tragedy. And director Spike Lee shoots scenes in New York quite well, in my opinion, as the audience is introduced to Dalton and his robbers, each named Steve, or Stevie, or Steve-O, as well as the other characters in the bank before Dalton and his thieves start robbing the bank, starting by putting out lights on the cameras while nobody is watching them, and the robbery begins with their orders while making a big withdrawal at the bank, and a cop comes by and sees smoke while Dalton tells him to not get to the cops involved, as he has multiple hostages. And this introduction is a very good point of view of who the bad guys are in this movie, as they're menacing. We get introduced to Detective Keith Frazier, played by Denzel Washington, as he talks to his girlfriend, who also works at NYPD, as well as his partner, Detective Bill Mitchell, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, before he was ever in 12 Years a Slave. As they get the call, as we get introduced to the bank owner, Arthur Case, played by Christopher Plummer, when he's altered the situation, and Keith and Bill get to the crime scene and hear from the sergeant who called in the bank robbery, while the robbers separate the customers from the employees at the bank and collect their things like keys, cell phones, and electronics, as they make everyone strip to their underwear, as one elderly woman refuses to do so, and they put on masks and jumpsuits. As I really enjoy the fact that this movie is about cops versus criminals, and Spike Lee pulls that off quite well, in my opinion. Keith and Bill get introduced to Captain John Darius, played by Willem Dafoe, as Keith demands what he and Bill will be doing by working together, while one of the robbers gets a heavily breathing man, as it could be the end of him, and get him out of the wheelchair and bring him outside as to the cops, as the plot kicks into gear super quickly, as we get to Keith and Bill going through interviews while Arthur's fixer Madeline White, played by Jodie Foster, who comes off unlikable in this movie, but as for the rest of the characters, I like them, as I believe they do a successful job as their characters and their roles, while the detectives Keith and Bill go through interviews after interview, interviews after interviews, as they never get the robber's face based on their disguises, as this movie is incredibly fucking intense, as there's a lot going on throughout the movie. Arthur wants to keep the locks locked up while meeting with Madeline, as Keith calls the bank to negotiate with Dalton, as he sees video footage of cameras before they blinded the cameras, and we go back and forth again and again from robbery to the interrogation between the detectives and the hostages, and we get another hostage exiting the crime scene with some kind of thing, while Madeline asks the judge for a kind of favor to call, or was it the mayor? I think it was the mayor. Some kind of favor to call some people to help with the investigation, and more cops cars show up to the crime scene, as Keith, Bill, and Captain Darius interrogating the hostages that just was let go, as he doesn't know what to say, and the acting in this was decent. Arthur talks with Keith, Bill, and Captain Darius about how the robbers want a jet, but they don't give it to them, as the score is very constructed, as a couple of thieves bring out a note to Keith and Bill saying the hostages are hungry for food and water, and they get them pizzas and sandwiches as well as a bunch of water, while one of the hostages takes off his mask and talks loudly like a smartass he is, until Dalton takes him away from his group to beat his ass up, which is a stupid move on the hostage's part. And we go back to the interrogation between Keith and Bill and the hostages as food and water gets to the bank, and Keith tries to get a word out of him, and by him I mean Dalton, but he says nothing. And I like Clive Owen as the menacing bank robber than a hero in Antoine Fuqua's King Arthur that I reviewed last year. Or was it 2 years ago? I can't remember which one it was. Meanwhile, the robbers put different people in different rooms, and we go back to the interrogation room, with Keith and Bill, and the cinematography is very well shot throughout, as this is a good shot film by Spike Lee. The detectives, as well as other cops, including Captain Darius, hear the foreign language as Keith asks anybody watching if they know the language, as it's Albanian, as a construction worker knows it from his ex-wife, as he doesn't speak it, but he knows it as they get him to call his ex-wife to understand what the robbers are saying are in Albanian, while Dalton helps a kid with some pizza and water, as the kid shows the Dalton how the PSP works. Do you remember that? And shows him the video game he's playing on the PlayStation Portable. Remember those things back in like mid-2000s? Because I had one once. And something about a piece of score made me think of Spike Lee's later film, in which I reviewed before, Black Klansman, as it sounded familiar. And when I get to that one scene in particular, I'll bring it up then. While Keith and Bill bring in the ex-wife of the construction worker to understand what the fuck they're saying, as she laughs at it until she gets kicked out of the cops. And the cops see if they can handle the parking tickets she had, and they're like, fuck that. And we move on to Stevie opening a drawer of a file of some kind, and Dalton collecting it, as Keith meets the judge and Madeline as they tell him this robbery of information they have is beyond their pay grade. And this is why Jodie Foster comes off unlikable, in my opinion, is she comes off rather disgraceful to the cops, I'll say it best. Keith gets on the phone with Dalton as they don't know each other's names as they negotiate, which doesn't go well, as Dalton wanting a fucking plane, as Keith is working very hard to get him one, while Madeline watches from the cafe across the street, in which we do see a couple of times throughout, and we get an interrogation with Keith and Bill and a hostage, and who wants some water, as he refuses to answer his questions while Keith is on the phone with Dalton about how hard he's working to get what he wants. And the dialogue was well written, as Dalton asks a riddle, and they take a second to answer, as their answer is a train station, which makes perfect sense, while Keith calls his girlfriend who works at NYPD and brings out Madeline to talk with Dalton, and she offers to give him what he wants and makes an offer he can't refuse, and goes in the bank and chats with him inside the bank about her offer, but he unfortunately refuses and kicks her out of the bank, and this is very well acted throughout by the actors. Madeline treats Keith like he's an idiot, as he tells her off and how much he hopes to never see her again. And that was good attention by Denzel and Jodie Foster, as we get a couple of interrogations with the kid and his father, as we get a couple of hostages, as Keith and calls Dalton to talk with him about a plane getting ready, as they bullshit him, which was a clever way to bullshit a robber. And he goes inside to get the hostages and tells them they're going to be okay, and he promises them. And this was fucking intense. Keith leaves the bank saying he won't get out comfortably and mocks Dalton, and Keith almost beats his ass up. And after he's out, he believes he's got Dalton behind his back, and we hear a phone call coming, and he sees a hostage getting killed, as we get the classic Spike Lee shot for the second time, as one was with Christopher Plummer, and the second one is with Denzel running towards the bank, and says the line, "This ain't no bank robbery." Like I said, there's a lot going on here, as Captain Darius calls Keith's boss out of bed and to come out to the crime scene, as he kind of chews him out, and Captain Darius explains why a way to get the hostages the fuck out of there, And there may be problems with it, as this is a smartly written film by Spike Lee. Keith learns he's getting promoted after his bank robbery is over, after his boss chewing his ass out, as the next day comes and Keith asks the sergeant about what happened between him and the kid pointing a gun at him, in which he brought up earlier in the film, as Keith tells Captain Darius to stand down as he goes in anyways to get the hostages out of there, and as the thieves gather them together and get them outside as they blow up the bank. And I'm like, don't tell me the motherfucking hostages are get dead. They come out as the cops shoot a few of them dead and gets them all down. And I'm thinking, where the hell are the bank robbers? And why the fuck did the cops shoot a few of them down? As they're not supposed to shoot anyone unless that they have guns. None of these people had guns, as the cops looked for the robbers, but they escaped with the file Dalton took earlier in the film. And there were a few minutes of problems with the movie by the cops, but that may be Spike Lee's choice of as a piece of score from Black Klansman playing in the background. And I'm like, Spike, what the fuck are you doing using this piece of score 12 years later? As that was the only nitpick I have. Well, part of this few minutes is where I have my only nitpicks with the movie for a while. Meanwhile, they get the hostages on the bus out of the crime scene, as Keith has the reports for his boss about who the bad guys are, as they have nothing, and the editing could have been trimmed down. But this one scene, as I don't think this is necessary, but if it weren't for that scene, it would have been a tightly edited movie. As Keith learns something was stolen, as they're getting sued by the people who refuse to answer questions, while Keith has police business in the courthouse, and tells Madeline how this is going to go down, and she's going to visit Arthur at his preferred barber shop, as she does in the next scene in the men's restroom, or next to it, I'll say, which is kind of a weird place for a barber shop, in my opinion, as she tells Arthur he got rich for doing business with the Nazis 60 years ago, as he sold his soul to the devil, and she knows something is corrupt with Arthur, and she walks out. And this was a nicely shot scene for a barbershop scene. Although, don't get me wrong, I like the movie Barbershop, but it's been a while since I've seen those movies. Dalton goes back to the bank and finishes the job and walks out with his thieves, while he bumps into Keith, and he didn't suspect a damn thing, as he looks at the safe, and Keith and Bill see nothing as Dalton puts his file back to where it belongs. And we move on to Keith and Bill having a meeting with Arthur, as Keith discovers the same exact thing Madeline discovered a few minutes ago about the corrupt bank manager, as he's a bad man, which makes so much sense once it connects the dots. And Keith sees the mayor as a corrupt man, as he puts him in jail, while Madeline happens to be there, and he gets home to his girlfriend from the NYPD, as well as his brother, who's the only family she has. And the climax made this movie make more sense by the time this movie ends, as it was satisfying. But how satisfied was I? Let's talk about it. I'll give this movie a 7.8 out of 10. I like we get the point of view of characters. For example, the thieves in the first 10 minutes of the movie are menacing, while the cops and the owner of the bank, aka the Christopher Plummer character, wants to help the bank robbers, as this isn't just a bank robbery. There's a lot going on throughout the movie. And I really enjoy the fact that this movie is about cops versus criminals, and Spike Lee pulls that off quite well, in my opinion. The plot kicks into gear super quickly, and I like the characters except for Jodie Foster. She comes off very unlikable, but as for one of the characters, I like them, as the actors do a successful job with their roles, as this movie is incredibly fucking intense with me on the edge of my seat throughout the entire movie, and the shots are tremendous, as it tells me it's a Spike Lee joint. The acting in this movie was decent, and the score was very well constructed, with the cinematography in this was very well shot. And this is a recommendation for the movie, as the dialogue was well written, as when I get to the end of the movie, it makes so much more sense, as this is very well acted throughout by the actors, and we get a couple of Spike Lee shots that felt very well done. And the only thing I will critique about this is a piece of score that will be reused again in Black Klansman 12 years later. And that felt like a ripoff, but otherwise, this was a good movie that ended up satisfying by the end of the day. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time we'll be back with Highest to Lowest, the final film of Spike Lee and Denzel, since I've heard Denzel's going into retirement. And until then, show enough, you dig?